Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce today's Gold Room Lectures. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Gold Room Lectures are a series of open lectures that we hold here at Harlaxton for members of the college, local community and the general public, and today we were able to have some people who are thinking about becoming Ridgeway Scholars with us as well, so that's all very excellent. Now, every semester we have guest lecturers from our visiting faculty in UK universities, specialists in their field, and they come and they give us an academic lecture. There's normally about 4 or 5 each semester. Now, in the recent past, the lecture series has started off with a lecture from a member of our visiting faculty, and this evening our guest lecturer is going to be Dr. Theresa Kemp, who's opening this semester's Gold Room lecture series. Dr. Kemp is a professor of critical studies in literatures, cultures and film at Wisconsin Eau Claire, where she's been on the faculty since 1999. I probably wasn't supposed to say that. Hey ho. She's also affiliated to the Faculty of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the university. Theresa's written extensively on the representations of women and gender in relation to heresy and mysticism in late medieval and early modern England. She's also published articles accounting for women's class alliances in furthering familial ambitions through such things as patronage and theatrical business. Her book, Women in the Age of Shakespeare, explores the ancient and medieval ideas that Shakespeare drew upon in creating his great comedic and tragic heroines, female characters such as Portia in The Merchant of Venice, Kate in The Taming of the Shrew, and my particular favourite, Lady Macbeth. Theresa shows how Shakespeare's portrayal of women offers a glimpse into the realities of women's daily lives across the social spectrum. She's currently writing her next book, which is going to examine the daily lives of ordinary women through the examination of social, cultural and material histories during the early modern period. And so Dr. Kemp's lecture this evening is going to explore the 16th century witches of Warboys, looking at class, religion and gender in relationship to witches. So with that, I shall pass you over to Dr. Theresa Kemp.
All right, thanks for joining us this evening. On 6 April 1593, all 3 members of the Samuel family, Alice, John, and Agnes, were executed in Huntington, having been found guilty of bewitching to death the Lady Susan Cromwell and unsuccessfully attempting the same crime on the 5 daughters of Robert Throckmorton of Warboys. Almost immediately, a lengthy and seemingly anonymous pamphlet appeared entitled "The Most Strange and Admirable Discovery of the Three Witches of Warboys." The pamphlet, speaking in the plural we, claims to demonstrate to skeptics the serious and very real nature of witchcraft. Decidedly pro-Throckmorton in its stance, the victimization of Robert Throckmorton's 5 daughters takes center stage, while the bewitching to death of the Lady Cromwell, which legally was the more important and the capital charge against the Samuels, receives only passing mention. Despite the legal victory of the Throckmortons, the pamphlet's swift appearance and its contents suggest that the trial's verdict had not entirely quelled not only debates about the existence of witchcraft, but also popular opinion that the Throckmorton daughters were really ill-mannered and their family deadly bullies. While the pamphlet's history has been most linked to discussions of possession and skepticism about witchcraft, I believe that it also provides insight into the tensions over the construction and negotiations of 16th and 17th century codes of gentry at a time of intense local social mobility. In the process of recounting the evidence of the case, the pamphlet's keen attention to minutiae inadvertently reveals a dangerously slippery terrain between social statuses in early modern England. Details of clothing, architectural space, and interactions among the neighbors figure casually but intriguingly amid this battle over the literal possession of the girls. And I realize that a lot of people don't know much about the 16th and 17th century or about the complexity of how people thought about witches in this period. So I'm going to give a little overview before I actually talk about the Warboys pamphlet. So there's a number of ways that are even contradictory about how people thought about witches during this period. We have folk experiences, elements that have to do with the recent Reformation that happened in the 1630s and 40s. So by this time, 1590s, there are still people living who had gone through the Reformation. Legal statutes, there are scholars and experts who write on demonologies and other kinds of theological treatises. There are necessary pamphlets, that is, pamphlets that are being presented to the public because it's such a horrible danger that people absolutely must know about this. And then there are trivial pamphlets, which are really kind of like true crime dramas, just selling things for the scandal of the story. And then there are also people who didn't believe in witchcraft, who thought that there were other things happening, so there were also skeptics. So I'm going to overview some of these. So, to begin with, there are folk experiences and regular everyday people. In this period, there was sometimes a fine line between what were known as cunning women or wise women and witches. And women in the households of all estates often were the first line of health care, and numerous herbal recipe books survive from many wealthy households. In villages, certain women might be known for their skill as herbalists and healers, and often villagers would turn to such women to be healed, or also to help them with what we might think of as more psychological needs, such as how to get somebody to love them, or how to get somebody who loves them to stop loving them, or how to be victorious in engaging with enemies. So women also served as wet nurses and midwives, and this also becomes an important location in terms of witchcraft in two ways. First, there were conflicts over who could get hired for these positions, and at times conflicts over those get connected to accusations of witchcraft. And secondly, if people failed in those performances, if the babies died, or the mothers died, or the patients died, there could be accusations of witchcraft either against the person who had failed or against other people who had wanted the job but didn't get it, trying to undermine them. So while people may commonly think of witchcraft accusations as examples of powerful men oppressing poor women, I think it's important to note that many of the cases involved arguments among the women themselves about things like employment and or the quality of their work. But some conflicts also did occur, as we'll see, between wealthier employers and servants in their employment. The other area in which, oops, I've sort of forgotten some of my, so this is Elizabeth Stiles, who was a Chelmsford witch, and you can see that she's feeding her familiars, which are toads and some sort of squirrel animal. So there's an anxiety about her providing her nurturing activities in improper ways, and then here's what happened to the rest of the Chelmsford witches. But a lot of their accusations were sort of circulating around midwife positions and wet nursing positions. There was also an emphasis on connecting cases to Catholics. In England, the shift from Roman Catholicism to Protestantism as the official religion began in the mid-16th century, and many accused witches were elderly during this period, and so they were old enough to have gone through the Reformation, to have started out Catholic and then been alive when it was officially required to be Protestant. Because they were typically illiterate and often irregular attendants to church, they might not have kept up with the changing doctrines. While some of their mumblings may have in fact been curses, they also might have been mismemorized or corrupted Latin prayers. And so, for example, hocus pocus, which we still connect to magic, right, is believed by some to have come from a corruption, either unintentional or intentionally, demonically, a parody of the Catholic liturgy on the Eucharist, which contains the phrase, hoc est enum corpus meum, meaning this is my body. Additionally, some of those accused, especially in the northern parts of the country, seem to have been connected to resistance that was more generally up in that area to the dissolution of the monasteries and the shift of the church to the Church of England from Catholicism in the second half of the century. So that seems to play a part in witchcraft trials during this piece of time. Another common tale that we find in a number of cases is what I would call failed charity, or what other scholars have called failed charity. Changing economics also plays a role here. A common plot to the story of witchcraft accusations involves conflict between those who denied charity to indigent or poor people. In such cases, a poor person would beg for things like food or objects that they need, or try to trade worthless things or trash for something of more value, like milk or yeast or something. And when the person who's being asked denies them, they sometimes walk away muttering complaints, right? So for example, a peddler coming upon a teenage girl in Pendle, in the northern part of the country, seems to have had a stroke almost immediately after refusing to give, or depending on whose story we're reading, sell cheaply some pens to her. And she walks away muttering something angrily, and so right after he has a stroke. As a consequence of this case, she turns in her relatives, who turn in other relatives, who turn in relatives in another family, and 9 people are hung. 2 families almost entirely wiped out as a consequence. But this theme of charity being denied seems to have been a common one that occurs throughout. There were also legal concerns. It's not just rural and uneducated people who are involved in this. Religious and civic authorities feared that the Reformation had unleashed a demonic backlash of anti-Christian forces. And in 1542, Parliament passed the Witchcraft Act, which defined witchcraft as a crime punishable by death. And there were various versions of this crime, or this act, over the course of time. And when James VI becomes James I of England, he also passes his own version of the Witchcraft Act. I'll come back to this in a minute, but in 1736, the law is repealed, but it imposes fines and imprisonment for those who claim to be able to harm with spells, and then later laws connect witchcraft to things like fraud and vagrancy. But James VI of Scotland was definitely a believer in witches. He believed that when he was bringing his wife, Queen Anne, from Norway to Scotland after their marriage, that witches had tried to conjure a tempest to sink his ship and kill them. And so this is up, you can see the ship up in the corner and the witches. Fortunately, of course, God is watching out for James, and so nothing happens. But on the right-hand side, we can see him proceeding over the trial of the witches who were convicted and duly hung. He also created a book called Demonology, in which he outlines the various ways in which you can discern the witches and hunt them down, tell when they're present. He also covers things like werewolves and other kinds of dangers. But he certainly saw witchcraft as being a prime threat to national security. If we look closer to our home here in Harlaxton, we can also find witches. If you look straight down the long driveway on a clear day and off to the left, you'll see Beaver Castle, home to the present 11th Duke of Rutland. And then if you look straight down, you have to be on a higher floor than the first floor. You can see sometimes in the distance, if it's clear enough, the steeple of the Bodisford Church, where centuries of descendants of the Rutlands lie buried, including little Francis and Henry Manners, the sons and heirs of the 6th Earl of Rutland. And these boys were killed by wicked practice and sorcery in 1612. Whoops, there we go. So if you go to the church in Bodisford, you can see the boys along with effigies of other Rutlands there. On the bottom is a little excerpt from the plaque that commemorates their murder by wicked practice and sorcery. And then a pamphlet was created in response to this case about the 3 women who had been hired by the Rutlands in order to help prepare the castle for the arrival of James I. And for various reasons, their work wasn't satisfactory. They didn't think that they were up to snuff. They fired them and were then accused of getting various pieces of clothing and performing spells on them, gloves and things like that, to cause the boys to die. Since then, there are other theories about what happened, but there they are. As I mentioned, there were also skeptics. Some early modern people were also skeptical of the existence of witchcraft, and Reginald Scott composed Discovery of Witchcraft, which argued that witchcraft was really a result of misdiagnosing Catholic heresy, giving old, scary women more power than they actually had, and most of all, it was a result of fraud and deception on the part of magicians. And his book continues to be, I don't know if there are magicians in the audience, but they may know this book. Magicians continue to be interested in Scott's book because he shows how they do the tricks. Like if you want to make your head appear here and your body appear here, you can look in that book and it'll tell you how to do it. So my point is that there were skeptics, there were believers, it was rural people, it was urban people, it was highly educated people, it was totally illiterate people in terms of reading and writing. We also have theatrical versions of the witchcraft trials that take a kind of complicated and skeptical view. In 1621, the play The Witch of Edmonton explores witchcraft from a skeptical perspective. Based on an actual case involving Elizabeth Sawyer, the playwrights introduce a devil dog who weaves together her sad tale with several additional fictional plots involving a bigamist who murders his heiress wife, an aristocrat who seduces his servant and then with promises of marriage and then pawns her off to another man, a group of Morris dancers, and a village full of uncharitable hypocrites who beat and taunt Mother Sawyer for scrounging scraps of food and wood from their land. So all of the village's woes end up being blamed on Mother Sawyer, and the lines that they create for her are these: "And why on me? Why should the envious world throw all their scandalous malice upon me? 'Cause I am poor, deformed, and ignorant, and like a bow buckled and bent together by some more strong in mischiefs than myself. Must I for that be made a common sink, for all the filth and rubbish of men's tongues to fall and run into? Some call me witch, and being ignorant of myself, they go about to teach me how to be one, urging that my bad tongue by their bad usage made so, forspeaks their cattle, doth bewitch their corn, themselves, their servants, and their babes at nurse. This they enforce upon me, and in part make me to credit it." So she doesn't necessarily start off to be a witch, but she does get caught cursing by the devil dog, which is not a good thing. So, the Witches of Warboys. Now you've got some context. The case in Warboys that we will be examining tonight veers significantly from the common pattern involving conflicts over demands for charity or employment, and the increasing tensions between the very poor and their more fortunate neighbors. In its own time, the pamphlet seems to have been used as evidence on both sides of the developing debates about witchcraft, as both a necessary instruction to people that there is a real and present danger, but also that it was a fraud. The authors of this pamphlet claim that they have been compelled to write in order to inform the public about the very real and present dangers of witchcraft. My focus in this talk, however, is not on the pamphlet's relation to demonic possession, exorcism, or emerging debates about evidence. Rather, I'm interested in how the pamphlet implicitly articulates tensions over the construction and negotiation of codes of gentry conduct at a time of local social mobility. According to the pamphlet, the Throckmorton family had just moved to Warboys into the mansion when on the 10th of November, 1589, their 10-year-old daughter, Jane, fell upon the sudden into a strange kind of sickness and distemperature of her body. Over the course of the next 3.5 years, the child engaged in inordinate sneezing, sometimes for half an hour at a time, screeching, groaning, and almost always at socially inopportune times, and she was unable to pray or even hear the Bible read. Consequently, much of the household's attention, and eventually all of Warboys, as dozens of neighbors came to visit the sick child, began to focus on her. It was during one of these sickbed visits that Jane began to single out their next-door neighbor, Alice Samuel, an elderly yeoman's wife, as being the cause of her outrageous behavior. Unable to imagine how they could have inspired animosity, however, having only been in Warboys since September, the child's embarrassed parents reprimanded her for her rudeness, and then presuming that some sort of illness was the cause, quickly sent a urine sample to a famous Cambridge doctor. Over the course of the next 3 months, however, 4 more sisters and 7 housemaids in the house fell into similar fits. When attempts to provide medical explanations failed, the Throckmortons turned to supernatural explanations. And soon the children's maternal uncles, Gilbert and Henry Pickering, arrived on the scene with a mass of Cambridge University-inspired information concerning the discernment of witches. And Cambridge was sort of a place of creating the scholarly literature on this at the time. During the next 3.5 years, all 3 members of the Samuel family, Alice, her husband John, and their adult daughter Agnes, one by one would face charges of witchcraft. And on April 6, 1593, the entire family was convicted and hung to death in Huntingdon. While I provide here a contextual reading of how the girls' possession manifests, I make no attempt to explain what actually happened or what actually drove them into their fits. Rather, my focus is on the ways in which an incompatibility between certain behaviors by both the victims and the witches on the one hand, and transforming notions of precedence in gentry and yeomen households and warboys on the other, played a key part in the representation of this case in the most strange and admirable discovery of the Three Witches of Warboys. Details from the pamphlet suggest the Throckmortons fit contemporary definitions of the gentry. There's an emphasis on intellectual rather than manual or trade education. Male members of both the Throckmorton and Pickering families were Cambridge educated in law and medicine. And importantly, the Throckmorton children of both sexes were literate, both boys and girls. All of this results in a particular lifestyle. The family's intellectual and spiritual activities depended upon leisure and literacy, and the pamphlet is filled with the incidental details of their daily routines, which included playing games, reading, engaging in other leisure activities, hosting entertainments for visiting relatives and other guests, and traveling to visit other elite families as guests. Because leisure and expendable wealth figure centrally in the defining of the gentleman, the dining table of the great household became a significant stage. A significant stage upon which to display both wealth and gentle hands unsoiled by manual labor. We see the importance of the fine manners to the gentry in the flood of printed books and manuals on etiquette as well. And here we have Baron Cobham and his family, and so you can see the food, a little bit of silverware. I'm not sure what the bird is doing on the table. But fruits, plates, and the interesting, I think, is how little the children are, and as I talk, how still and proper they are at this table. So the books that came out instructing people on how to conduct themselves were also important during this period. The rules of conduct emphasize proper posture, prohibitions against fidgeting, along with the proper use of eating utensils, which were somewhat new in this period. Previously, people had been eating from common trenchers or scooping food out with bits of bread, and the poor people were still doing this, right? So how to use these newfangled utensils was also important. In his now classic work on the civilizing process, Norbert Elias has shown how bodily control increasingly came to be perceived, and probably still continues to be, a defining feature of civility in Western culture. The demonic possession of the Throckmorton girls manifests in ways that transgress these elite conventions, and especially table manners. The timing and the manner of the children's fits must have been especially horrifying to the parents, as they become especially connected to key social moments such as meals, prayers, and holidays and special occasions where there are the presence of visitors in the house to witness what's going on. Mealtimes were especially common occasions for outrageously disruptive behavior, with the girls inappropriately wielding their eating utensils, mangling food in their mouths, and breaking forth with rude and animal-like noises. This is actually a woodcut of ranters who were a religious sect from the period, but one of the things that they were criticized for were their bad social manners and their inability to properly use a dining table, right? They're flailing about there. The pamphlet on the Warboys case doesn't have any woodcuts to it, so I've had to kind of supplement from other pictures here. But we do get lots of verbal descriptions. During meals, they had merry fits. One of the daughters puts her hand beside her meat and her meat beside her mouth, making her miss her mouth, and she would sometimes smile and sometimes laugh hysterically at her inability to get the food to go where it was supposed to go. Her other sister is even more extremely used at meals, and she falls into an extreme fit, bowing and bending her body as if she would have broken her back, and shaking her hands so that she couldn't hold her knife steadfastly. So there's just chaos. There's 5 of them, right? And then 7 servants who are kind of out of control here. The Throckmorton girls' immoderate sneezing, shrieking, and jerking movements at the table produce a casebook study in negative exempla on how to break all the rules of proper table conduct as promoted in the books. Ill-mannered people, according to the manuals, are compared to animals, and readers are warned against such beastly behaviors as overfilling the mouth and smacking one's lips, as commonly do hogs. Early modern writers perceived the lack of physical and verbal control displayed by those untrained in good manners as indicators of bestial nature and attendant moral faults. And here we have a Bruegel painting that is a little bit of eating, lots of drinking, but definitely chaos and moral faults happening. The particularly popular book, Civility and Children, which was written by the famed humanist scholar Erasmus, condemned diners who were unable to control their bodies as disgusting and insane, and he described such behavior as a rustic embarrassment. The godliness of gentlewomen in particular was defined in terms of bodily control. And here we have a Puritan family who everybody is praying and straightforward and pretty clear that they know that they're being watched. Right? The godliness of gentlewomen in particular was to be controlled, industrious in activity, and to restrain from frivolity, all of which were things that the Throckmorton girls were not very good at. One of the daughters is, in addition to being unable to eat properly at the table, seems only capable of card playing, picnicking with other children, and playing at bowls or other sports. Otherwise, she has fits. Occasionally, she attempts to read, but she can't hear anyone correct her whenever she misterms a word or slips in any way. Then she goes back into her fits. Although the most powerful and elite family in the village, news of the girls' behavior would have spread quickly, for the Throckmortons were not up at the big house. And it's important to remember that it's not until the 18th century that elite families began to prefer secluded residences. Rather, the manor house was right in the middle of everything. And so here's a map. You can see St. Mary Magdalene's Church. There's a street in front of it. The building with the X is the manor house. And if you go straight up, that would have been north. The Samuel family is said to have lived in the house next door. That house seems to be gone. There's now an 18th century barn, which is now apparently a very nice posh house, in the way that British people are turning barns into beautiful homes. So everything would have been right there. The Warboys Manor lay smack in the middle of the village, where their troubles would have been woven into the threads of the communal fabric regulating private life. And so here's an actual picture of the church, and you can see how close the manor house is, and then right next door would have been where the Samuels lived, and probably other people. As the 16th century writer William Heel notes, the household was not a private space, but rather, as it were, an open theater where we have stores of spectators, our children, our servants, our neighbors, sometimes our nearest kindred, ofttimes our dearest friends. And it was in this open theater of the small village of Warboy that the conflict between these two households was staged to its deadly conclusions. Whoops. So now I'm going to talk about the Samuels. We don't have their house anymore. And we don't have any pictures of them either. Unlike the Throckmortons, the Samuels family did not live a life of leisured gentry class. They labored in the fields and personally ran their own errands rather than sending servants. Nevertheless, they seem to have occupied a position of local yeoman significance in Warboys. The gentry lifestyle of the Throckmortons required servants, an increasing problem as one by one their servants began to flee the demonic chaos in the manor house. And as the manor emptied of its servants, the Throckmorton family increasingly turned their attention to the Samuel women to fill the void. In resisting the call to service and demands, in deference to their own household duties, the Samuels end up forced into the role of bewitching scapegoat for the children's uncivilized behavior. While certainly poor in comparison to the Throckmortons and not well connected, the Samuels were probably not as poor as some scholars have previously envisioned them. The Huntington Public Records Office retains the records of John Samuel's taxes, fines that he paid, and other legal matters that suggest a sort of local status and influence in the small world of Warboys. In a village of about 50 households, the Samuels were only one of 7 who were wealthy enough to be levied a periodical tax. Upon their execution, their estate was turned over, according to the laws of attainder, to Henry Cromwell as lord of the manor. The sum was large enough to endow an annual sermon on the dangers of witchcraft, and the sermon was annually and duly continued for more than 200 years, based on this amount of money. The historical records suggest that the Samuels were financially stable and among the more substantial members of the community prior to the arrival of the Throckmortons. Warboys was a village that scholars have described as being, at the time, unaccustomed to rendering special place to a resident of Robert Throckmorton's social class. So it's not surprising then that this rendering of special place was not without a battle on the part of the Samuels. And amid the pamphlet's dominant narrative of the disruption of the Throckmortons' gentle, godly household by the demonic possession of their daughters, we can also discern the constant disruption of the Samuels' yeoman household activities as a central refrain in the pamphlet as well. In the lowly context of the general Warboys population, the Samuels proceed, especially at first, as if they are important members of the community. And indeed, when members of the village come to attend the young girl in her initial illness, Alice Samuel is premier among the visitors. But the sick girl almost instantly highlights her perception of the older woman's inappropriate combination of low-class attire and physical appearance on the one hand, and her presumption of a place of importance as a visitor on the other hand. Particularly troubling is Mother Samuel's thrummed cap. So there's a modern depiction of a thrummed cat, and then Margaret Flower, one of the Beaver Witches, on the left hand seems to be wearing possibly a thrummed cap. So a thrum cap is made of scraps of thread or yarn or thrums, and if you turn it inside out, it's waterproof, and then the little fuzzy things will keep your head warm. And so a month later, Jane's sisters likewise begin to draw attention to Mother Samuel's thrummed cap. At best, a thrum cap would have been a functional article of clothing, if not a sign of being in league with the devil. And this morning, students in the British Studies lecture learned a little bit about sumptuary laws. And so if we think about the role of clothing in placing people socially, the fact that she's wearing this thrummed cap, this cap that's not fashionable but is functional, but then acting as if she's an important visitor, there's a dissonance for the girls about this. So it was certainly not an inextricable part of a fashionable coif, and her failure to remove the cap in deference to her social betters only inflames the girls against her. In addition, the place in the parlor where Alice presumes to sit also apparently offends the child's sense of social hierarchy. This is actually the parlor of the Warboys Manor. It probably didn't look like that. I'm guessing it didn't have pink carpet. It was for sale a few years ago, and so there was a catalog online. Here we should know that 16th century developments in heating technology contributed to a widening gap between social groups. Separate rooms within larger homes, heated by means of a fireplace and chimney, provided a more exclusive alternative to the communal and relatively more public Great Hall. Moreover, space is socially valued according to the distance from the warmth of the fire in winter and the breeze of the door or windows in the summer. By taking up a seat in the chimney corner, right next to the child, Alice Samuel stakes a claim to honor among the visitors in the Throckmorton household on that chilly November day. So she would have sat close to the fire where it was warm, right? There's no fire here for you all, for our important people. At first, seemingly oblivious to the way the village social hierarchy has been revised by the arrival of the more powerful and wealthy family, the Samuels freely speak their opinions. They diagnose the Throckmorton girls as spoiled and in need of stricter discipline from their parents. And not surprisingly then, among the chief confessions to which the Samuels are forced to speak later on is a retraction of this earlier criticism, and that the fits were but wantonness on the part of the girls, and they have to confirm instead that it was some supernatural work in the patient. So that was happening as well. The conflict between the family that develops is unlike most of the other tales of witchcraft from this period, in that it doesn't center on demands of charity. It doesn't involve conflicts over wanting to be hired, but rather almost the reverse. As the story unfolds and the Throckmorton servants begin to flee, they increasingly seek to press Mother Samuel and then later her daughter Agnes into domestic service, despite their growing sense that the Samuels are somehow behind the supernatural work against their children. So that's sort of odd. Like the 7 maidservants who early on flee the Warboy Manor, the Samuels are also eager to escape the drama in the Throckmorton household. But perhaps because of their age and deep roots in Warboys, making a complete break with the village and finding a new livelihood elsewhere would have been more untenable or perhaps even unthinkable solution for them than for the young servants. They can't leave. As time goes on, competing claims to Mother Samuel's labor, along with the matter of John Samuel's influence in his own home, figure centrally in the narrative. The pamphlet claims that initially, Robert Throckmorton has offered John £10 a year for his permission to employ his wife so that he can hire another servant to take on her duties. When John adamantly refuses, Mr. Throckmorton responds by moving his children into the Samuels' small cottage to be under his care there. He's their landlord. At first, John tries to drive them out by being blatantly unhospitable. He quenches the fire and said he would starve them, along with other evil words. But when it becomes clear that they're not going to leave, he begins to promise that his wife will come to the manor tomorrow, and then the next day, tomorrow, and then the next day, tomorrow. And when, after several days, Alice doesn't come to the manor, Robert Throckmorton brings the girls back to the Samuels' cottage. So eventually John Samuel relents and allows his wife to board with their family. Once in the Throckmorton household, however, the children's fits continue and even increase. And although Mother Samuel repeatedly seeks to go home, she's refused permission and is basically held prisoner in the manor. Her captivity conflicts with the Samuels' sense of authority in their own household, and it seriously disrupts the basic tasks of her own day-to-day household routines, such as running errands and preparing meals for John Samuel upon his return from the fields. And again, we don't have an illustration, but this is an accused witch sailing over a river on a plank to get her things done. So I guess she's an early modern Samantha from Bewitched, getting things done magically. The gendered hierarchy in the Samuels household is overturned as both Alice and Agnes are caught between the claims of obedience to two patriarchal authorities, as Alice is being literally strong-armed by Gilbert Pickering into coming to the Warboys Manor. For example, she quickly whispers in her daughter's ear, urging her to quickly go home and make dinner for her father before he gets there. Elsewhere, the Pickerings freely interrupt Alice as she makes her rounds of daily errands. The Pickerings taunt her and grill her about her activities as a witch. Robert Throckmorton's offer to John Samuel to give £10 to replace her labor with another servant suggests that he at least implicitly recognized that some sort of issue of labor is at stake, though as far as we know, he never pays £10 for her to be in his home. So what seems somewhat surprising, at least to the Throckmortons at any rate, is that the Samuels resisted their call to be helpers in this new household. The Samuels' lack of deference and their refusal to yield their own domestic duties in order to play servant to the Throckmortons ultimately pits family against family. In the manor house, chief among Mother Samuel's tasks seems to have been enabling the Throckmorton adults to dine civilly while their children are behaving improperly. And this is also from the catalog. So I'm guessing again that the dining hall wouldn't have looked like this, but the table is long. Imagine 5 crazy girls possessed, how easy it would be to have dinner. So you have Mother Samuel trying to keep them in place while the rest of the people dine. And although pamphleteer claims that Mother Samuel does nothing but her own work, it's hard to imagine, given the extent of the children's disruptive behavior, that she would get to do any of her own work. And she's, at a certain point, not allowed to leave the house. This endures for nearly 3 years when Robert Throckmorton obtains a witnessed confession from her, and she's sent to Huntington Prison to await trial in January of 1593. So without Alice, the Throckmortons next conscript her daughter Agnes to tend to the girls in their fits, and so she has to stand behind them at each meal and sort of hop from girl to girl, and at this point the children can't walk, so she has to carry them up and down the stairs too. Like her mother, she understandably strives to leave the manor and return home, but her wishes are denied and even claimed as evidence of her guilt. Otherwise, why would she want to leave such a wonderful place? That the Samuels are uneducated, if not illiterate, and unmattered becomes a fact further used to indict them as witches. They reportedly speak loudly and they brawl. When Pickering and his school buddies from Cambridge confront Alice in the street as she's out doing her household errands, she's said to be very loud in her answers, impatient, and not suffering anyone to speak but herself. When one of the men desires that she keep the woman's virtue and be more silent, she answers that she was born in a mill, begot in a kiln, and she must have her will. She could speak no loftier. So she's kind of smarty too. Elsewhere, the Samuels, definitely not deferring to them. Elsewhere, the Samuels' inability to properly say the Lord's Prayer and the Creed is also used as evidence against them. And this was a common test of witches to see if they knew the Lord's Prayer or the Creed. But it seems difficult to gauge, for example, whether Agnes's inability to say the Creed and Our Father is a result of her ignorance, her not going to church, her fear, or, as the Throckmortons claim, her league with Satan. On the other hand, it's interesting that when the Throckmorton daughters are unable to say their prayers, it's demonic attack. It's while focused on the daughter Agnes, the least powerful of the Samuels, that the Throckmorton girls devise the lethal command that all 3 accused family members will ultimately be compelled to obey. In order to assuage their fits, the accused witch must confess not only to causing the fits, but also to consenting in the death of Lady Cromwell. And so this is the paradox that they're put into, is if they say these words, then the girls are fine, but if they won't say them, then the girls continue. So one by one, each Samuel is forced. The pamphlet uses the word taught to say the following charm: as I am a witch and consenting to the death of Lady Cromwell, so I charge thee demons to depart. This confession or charm eventually becomes the evidence of murder that condemns them to death. So perhaps because of his gender, John Samuel, the father, resists the longest in surrendering sovereignty in his household. Throckmorton must get permission from old John, which he has difficulty doing, and the narrator of the pamphlet complains repeatedly about their ability to get old Samuel to come to the house without first obtaining a precept from the justices, or rather they have to have a legal summons to make him come. So there's another farmer. The two times when John does appear at the manor house of his own volition are when his familial interests are at stake. In December 1592, we're getting close to the end of the story, he comes because someone has told him that there was something happening in the house concerning his wife, and indeed, Robert Throckmorton has just convinced Alice into a confession, one that is staged before the audience of listeners drawn from the church adjoining the manor house and secretly listening below the window. He's convinced her that just the two of them are talking, but he has arranged for these people to hear, so now he has witnesses. It is this confession that sends her to Huntingdon prison to await trial. And a few months later, in January 1593, John again arrives at the manor house claiming that he has been told his daughter was sick. Both instances suggest his connection to local villagers who are keeping him informed about what's going on in the manor house while he's out in the fields. So while many scholars of this period present witchcraft as being primarily about the oppression of women, it is important to remember that early modern patriarchy included systems of hierarchy that were as intricately bound to class and religion as to gender. While a homily on the state of matrimony clearly subjects wives to their husbands, and the homily was a sermon that was read at every church wedding during the period, the sermon also clearly endorses elite women's rule over inferiors of both sexes, including adult male servants and children. Ultimately, the class privilege of the Throckmorton girls enables them to insist upon and therefore determine the transgressive identities of all the Samuels, including John. In the end, even John loses his authority within his own home and is compelled to speak the assigned script of confession, or the charm. The power dynamic between children and adults reverses, placing estate above age, as the girls are empowered to correct the faults of their elder neighbors, and John in particular. Youth ultimately outranks age as Robert Throckmorton underwrites his daughter's authority, forcing both John and Agnes to listen to Elizabeth exhortations about their sins for an hour and a half. So they have to listen to a sermon from a teenage girl about their wickedness. The Samuels are damned by confessions that have been taught to them by their prosecutors, and they're hung for murder on the 6th of April, 1593, as a result of the words forced upon them. And again, we don't have a block print of their execution, but this is the Pendle witches a little bit later than them. You can see how they hang people. It's not very nice. Despite the pamphlet's attempt to rescue the Throckmorton girls' reputations, however, their family's ascent seems to have leveled off in the following generations. Moreover, the pamphlet came to be associated with fraudulent claims of possession. A decade after the pamphlet comes out, Anne Gunter, who was brought before the court of the Star Chamber for falsely accusing 3 women of bewitching her, had read the pamphlet, been coached by her father, and apparently used the pamphlet as a how-to manual on how to be possessed. And in his pamphlet, A Discovery of the Fraudulent Practices of John Darrell, Samuel Harsnett claims that the boy had heard and read some part of a very ridiculous book concerning one Master Throckmorton's children. It's also thought that perhaps the Salem witches in the Americas had had access to this book, which may have instructed them on how to have their fits. It was, however, too late for the Samuels. Had they not ended their lives spectacularly by hanging as convicted witches from the Huntingdon gallows, our knowledge of their existence, like the existence of so many other middling yeomen farmers of the time, probably would have faded beneath the dust covering the few and unremarkable archival traces about them, tax reports, fines, that kind of thing. While my focus here has been on the particular case in Warboys between the Throckmortons and Samuels, I believe the results encourage a greater consideration of the intersecting systems of power elsewhere, one that includes not only gender, but social class and religion as well, in analyzing the struggles over authority and precedence in the context of the history of witchcraft, but also more generally in the development of social mobility throughout this period. And thank you. Is there still time for questions?
Yeah, there's time. There's, as is our usual way at the end of this, we have some time for questions from the audience. So thank you very much for that talk. It was really, really informative. And I'm sure there must be some questions out there. There's Gurby. Oh, David, Dr. Green.
We do. I mean, a little bit. A couple of them sort of die in the way that if you have 7 kids, some of them aren't going to make it. Their marriages are not particularly, if you follow them through the marriages that they make, they're not particularly elevated. Nothing really happens with them. They don't keep having fits. They leave Warboys after the hanging. There is some sense that in the pamphlet it talks about sort of the suppression of other points of views. So there is a sense that there might have been some not total alliance with or sympathy with their family. And so they leave for another place, and then the children start to marry. But the marriages don't seem, I don't think, as spectacularly good as they think they might have been. And then they kind of disappear.
I'm surprised anybody wanted to marry them at all, given their table manners.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the Throckmortons were probably the neighbours from Hal.
Oh, yeah,
Because
sure.
it seemed like it was all very calm in Warboys until they moved in.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so, there does seem to be this sort of weird, Mike and I were talking about this, like if you're at a job and there's not really anybody in control and you start to do things the way you want to do them, or those of us who are teachers, we're in our jobs teaching and we kind of get to choose our classes, and then suddenly somebody comes in and says, you can't do the job the way that you used to do it, or you can't teach the classes that you want to do. I think they sort of came in and said, your household's not as important as ours.
Yeah.
And that's a mess.
It ended up as a mess.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Drew.
Is there any research on what we would, in modern times, probably diagnose the children with? Like what kind of mental illness, or if there's just
There's some, and because people are interested in it as possession, so there's, discussions of, what kinds of mental illness they might have had, given that it was so many of them, and the servants too, various, in this case, tends to focus on things like how mass hysterias happen. There's one point at which, when the girls start to say that Mother Samuel looks like a witch, it raises the question of how did they know what a witch looked like? If they had, we don't know that they've seen any, and there are records of, clearly people in the village would have now seen a witch, but chances are that maybe they read about them. So there's that kind of effect that could cause it. I'm less interested in it. It's possible, I know with the Salem witchcraft trials, they talk about ergot poisoning and other things like that. So maybe there was something in the house, argon, who knows.
But then after the Samuels were dead, the Throckmortons stopped having
They stopped having fits, yeah. So
Who knows?
So it's quite possible that they were, in fact, witches.
It's all very possible.
It's quite possible. I mean, if people believe in witches, then witches are possible, I think.
Oh, lots more questions. Let's take this question here.
Wondering why what are the evidences that women getting, or with those accused rather, getting justice
Yeah, actually, I mean, that's a really good question. And so another interesting part of this period of time is we often look back and we think, oh, those people were so ignorant. But they were trying very hard to be very stringent in the rules of evidence. And actually, only about a quarter of women who end up being prosecuted for witchcraft are convicted. So that's, I mean, the odds are sort of not so bad.
But if they were convicted, it was bad.
Yeah, if you're convicted, it's very bad. And nobody writes pamphlets about witches who aren't convicted. It's not interesting. Nobody's going to buy that. But the kinds of things that they use for evidence, I mean, are interesting. I mean, people often know about witch marks and those kinds of things, but the biggest kind of evidence that they used was testimony and witnesses of things like confessions, things like if they found puppets or dolls with pins in them or mutilated gloves like they did in Beaver, that would be evidence as well. The thing about the witness part of evidence is that witnessing was used as evidence for lots of crimes, not just that crime. That the idea legally that if enough people believed it, it must be true, could stand up in court as something that could convict people.
So that's why Robert Throckmorton had people hiding underneath windows when he was getting the confession out.
Yeah, and the pamphlet talks about that, you know, like in conversations, private conversation, then the frustration of like, well, it was just the two of us, right?
Yeah.
So then he restages it, and again, you know, in the way that even current law enforcement has what sometimes strikes me as sort of shady ways of getting confessions out of people by, you know, becoming buddies, those kinds of things. There's that sense that he's trying to get her to trust him and that it's really just between the two of him because he needs her to say it again when there are people who can hear it. And then once he's got that, then they can be called in and say, yeah, we heard her say that she's tried to kill Lady Cromwell. That's the part. Well, and she does. Yeah, that's the part that didn't make it into the talk. So there's this whole. Lady Cromwell is the landlord of both the Throckmortons and the Samuels, and so she comes to visit in the house, and while she's there, she sees what's happening with the girls, and so she has a conversation with Alice Samuel about them, and Alice is like, I'm not doing anything, and so Lady Cromwell pulls a chunk of hair out of her and throws it in the fire, which is supposed to undo the power of witches, right? If you break their bodily integrity somehow, that breaks the spells. And Alice
Isn't that witchcraft in itself?
Just saying.
Just saying.
Just saying. As was discussed in the British Studies lecture the other day, you know, one person's aggression is another person's defense.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And so Alice has the unfortunate wherewithal to say, why are you doing this to me? I've never done harm to you yet. And then Lady Cromwell has nightmares that night, and she becomes sick, and 2 years later she dies, and
Alice's fault.
yeah, I mean, to me what's interesting is how much the pamphlet is not about that, and that's the thing that would have convicted them to be hung, not the bewitching of the daughters. That's a bad thing, but that's not a capital crime in and of itself.
There was one thing about the pamphlet, just you showed the front title
Yes.
page. The thing that really intrigued me about that is spot the textual scholar. But
Yeah.
you know what I'm going to say, don't
I
you?
do.
May I?
Yeah.
Printed by the widow Orwen. So the publisher of this pamphlet is actually a woman, and that's really quite unusual.
Yeah.
I liked that.
That it was a widow. So it means that her husband probably had the printing shop.
And she carried on with that.
Yeah. Oh, I thought you were going to say this piece right here. So you've got, is it this? What's the thing that's the red? Oh, right there. So you've got all this thing about his daughters. Oh, yeah. And also the bewitching to death of Lady Cromwell. So, like an afterthought.
Yeah, no, she is an afterthought, isn't she?
Yeah,
she
she
does.
is.
So,
Well, she's been-
I saw some more questions. People with their hands up over this side, I think. Too. Oh, here we go.
think that's a really good question. So I think, you know, there are 7 servant maids who also end up briefly afflicted and then they leave. Even to be a maid in somebody's household is hard to leave because you have to have connections, right? Who's going to take them in? Given that they don't have a lot of resources, it's possible that there was some communication happening in the village between the Samuels and the people, you know, trying to get their support. And that seems to be maybe sort of subtext in the pamphlet, this idea that there are other versions of the story out there. We know that, I guess like lots of poor people who are accused of crimes, they get tricked, persuaded into turning evidence against other people. So like in Penville, I mean, they start turning on each other, partly in hopes that they're going to save their own necks, right, or get a more lenient sentence. And sometimes authorities led them to believe that that would happen. In the Samuels family, that doesn't happen. And in fact, they keep urging each other not to confess, even as they individually end up saying the charm, which is a confession. But no, there's not, I mean, if you don't have money, there's not really a whole lot you can do.
So it really is just as much about class as it is about gender.
Yeah, I would definitely say, I mean, in like modern day criminal systems, it's also about resources,
Yeah.
right, to get you out.
So, do we have any more questions out there?